right, is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Perfect. I know I'm the afternoon talk, and it's always so hard with energy levels, so I'm going to try to bring the energy, but bear with me here. My name is Christina Lee, and I am an Android developer at Pinterest. I've been there for 6 years, and I am also pursuing a professional certification in dog training. This handsome man here is my boy, Cash. Now, as we just heard, Cash is something special in that he knows how to speak using an assistive communication device. He knows about 90 words, and he is quite opinionated. His favorite thing to request is to go visit his grandparents. When I talk to people about all the things that I have learned from teaching my dog, they usually think about this. They're so impressed. And granted, it is pretty cool. He is being studied by a team of scientists. It's all new and groundbreaking, and that's really awesome. But it's a little bit of cheating, because to teach an organism to communicate, they are already very, very motivated. We don't have to force young children to communicate with us because they want things and they want to be able to tell you what they want. So in this regard, I basically had to give him this device, show him how it worked, and he picked it up. And that was because he was so robust to any challenges, because he had so much motivation to be understood, to be able to request to go to the park, to be able to tell me how he felt, to be able to request food. So in this regard, I could be an absolutely terrible teacher, and we still would have found success. Now, show me someone who has trained one of their animals to sit quietly by the door when a new and exciting person comes in, and I will be far more impressed. Because in those scenarios, what I want and what that animal wants are not the same thing. They think jumping on people is really fun, and I think it would be lovely if they sat still and didn't wiggle around. So in this regard, you really have to be good in your teaching technique, or you will not find success, because the environment is so rewarding that you are fighting an uphill battle. We find a lot of analogs in the human world. Some people are incredibly robust to challenges. We see this when we see people go into war zones or disaster zones and provide aid. The circumstances are terrible, and they find success anyways because they find that mission such a calling for them that they will power through any setbacks. But a lot of us do not fall into this category. A lot of us fall into this category, which is that we may love what we do, we may find it interesting, but we are also there to get paid. We want to get paid so we can afford housing, so we can afford food, entertainment, so we can place some bets maybe. It's very important to us. So while we show up and we like to be there, our motivations are a little bit more mixed. I can sure tell you that if I was not being paid to do what I do, I would not choose the same behavior chains that I do now. I would not get up early in the morning, hop on a train, go to the office, sit there for 8 hours, typing at a laptop, and then get up, take the train home, and do it all over again Monday through Friday. That is not what I would do. I would probably be here on one of those beautiful beaches that I just visited and never wanted to leave. And so in this regard, there's actually a lot of similarities in traditional animal training and what we're doing when we're working with people in a workplace, in that there's a lot of good intent there, but there's also something of a misalignment. And that means that if we want to help shape the behavior of junior engineers or coworkers that we are trying to up-level their skills with, we need to be very effective teachers, because we can't guarantee that we have extremely motivated learners who will be resilient to our teaching faults. So I wanted to present it in this light for a few key reasons. First, animal training tends to be a lot more simple than many of the interactions that we find in our day-to-day working with coworkers in a workplace, especially on something like an Android application that has a lot of complexity. And that simplicity means that we can focus in on what really matters for this talk, which is the effectiveness of how we communicate and work with the people around us in order to up-level their skills. There are very clear inputs and outputs in animal training in a way that it's really hard to achieve in a workplace with a big dynamic app. Second, We take out a lot of extraneous factors around what we think about people. In an ideal world, we would love everybody, and we would never have things like what they look like, how they speak, how old they are, or what their title is matter to us when we were communicating with them or working to up-level their skills. But we are human, and this is something that we do. When we work with animals, we tend to have just universally positive regard. Some people maybe don't like dogs. Don't know why, but it might be possible. I don't know, I won't judge. But many of us look at them and we assume good intent, and that is exactly the mindset that we wish we had with all of the people we were working with in the workplace. Third, and this is something of a bummer, because animal training is not regulated, we have a lot of insight into some less savory teaching techniques. Europe is so far ahead of the United States in this regard, but in the United States, it's still very common to train animals with things like e-collars, which shock them if they do something wrong, or slip or choke chains, which apply pressure to their neck to correct their behavior. So we have this huge, unfortunate body of evidence about what happens when we try to motivate people using negative techniques, and we hope to never find out what that is like in the human population. And lastly, the reason I wanted to look at it through this lens is because it's more fun. And it turns out that if I can make this a fun session for you, you are much more likely to retain some of what I tell you about this topic. It is important to make learning convenient, easy, and fun. And learning about this topic is important because if you're anything like me, your career might look a little bit like this, which is that you go to school, you learn something about programming. Maybe it was Android, maybe it was iOS, maybe it was something completely different. But chances are you were really bad at it back then. We all were. But as time goes on, you make some mistakes, you get better, and eventually you get to this really fun place where people want your opinion. This is amazing. It's super fun. And so there you are coding, and someone asks you about the retrofit integration, or they ask you about the migration to GraphQL or some architecture detail. And you're coding your feature, and you answer their request, and you go back to coding. But if you're really good at your job, what eventually happens is that those requests for mentorship and insight and passing on your valuable knowledge start to crowd out some of that coding. At this point in my career, I do far more work with the humans around me than I do with the machine that sits on my desk. And this is lovely, because you might find yourself somewhere here, and the views up there are probably really, really cool. But the skill set that you started with down on this flat path, just needing to walk along a sidewalk, is not the skill that you need at this new point in your career. Maybe now someone is looking at you and asking you if you know how to rappel down a cliff, and your terrified answer is, no, nobody told me I needed to know that. And so this is why this sort of talk is so important. Because once you become a tech lead, or even if you are not officially a tech lead, if you are just someone whose job is to work with other people, part of that job relies on a skill set in which you have no formal education. And that can be scary because, again, our jobs provide income, they're where we spend the vast majority of our day, and to be quite honest, we just like to feel successful. So basing our success and our financial security on a skill set in which we have no training can be terrifying, and it's not something that I wanted to leave up to chance. And so that's what we're doing here today. We're trying to bring a more scientific framework to what it can mean to be a good and accessible tech lead to any of your coworkers, whether you are officially a tech lead or just someone who wants to help up-level the people around you. In order to do that, we need to start way back at the beginning, which is the fundamental law of how animals modify their behavior. It's called Thorndike's law of effect, and it states in simplest terms that animals will seek pleasure and avoid pain. In the scientific journal, it uses a lot more words, but that's the basis of this law. For us, as people who are considering trying to modify the behavior of those around us by helping them learn new things, this is great because it means we have a few simple levers to pull, and there's really nothing else. All behavior changes according to one of these 4 options. There's something freeing about that. Either we are adding or removing something pleasurable in order to make that behavior more likely, in which case we are activating a pleasure-seeking system in a learner, or we are adding or removing something unpleasurable to that learner in order to cause that behavior to decrease. So, it turns out that there's one extra really interesting detail about these 2 paths that we can take. And that is that neurochemically, they appear to be mutually exclusive, in that the chemicals that enable one system are almost exactly the opposite as the chemicals that enable the other. Now, anybody who has ever opted into one last drink at the end of the night when they had already had enough probably knows this by intuition, that when you're in a pleasure-seeking mode, you are not concerned about what's going to happen the next morning or thinking about the threats that loom. And likewise, if you've ever had the misfortune to be chased by an angry bear, you are probably not at the same time thinking how nice it would be to go shopping or eat a nice cheeseburger. Your focus is on avoiding the angry bear and getting away from the threat. So, if we have these 2 facts, that we can modify the behavior of animals around us, whether they are dog or human, using these 2 levers, but only one can be used at once, it begs the question, which one should we use? And to answer that question, I'd like to do a little bit of a thought experiment. So say you are walking around this lovely city, and someone comes up and they tap you on the shoulder and they give you $1,000. You look at them and you say, wow, thank you. And then the next day you're walking, and someone does it again. They give you $1,000 again, or euro. If that continues to happen a few times, what are you likely to do with your behavior? Well, if you were me, you would quickly start strategizing to figure out how you can make that happen again. Maybe it was that I walked down that street at that particular moment in time. Or maybe it was what I was wearing. Or maybe I just need to find the person who gives the money, and then it'll keep happening. Regardless of what your thought process is, it's probably pretty creative, and it's probably pretty goal-oriented, in that you are trying to figure out how to keep those €1,000 rewards coming. If you flip this thought experiment, though, and you consider the other side, where you are walking around and something terrible happens. Maybe someone steals your wallet, or they hit you, or something else unpleasant happens. If this happens a few days in a row, where you're walking around a city and your wallet gets stolen, what are you going to do next? You will most likely really double down on finding a safe route home, from work to your home, that you know you will not be robbed or accosted on. Now, once you found that route, you would be very unlikely to deviate from it, because the cost of deviation puts you at risk of getting robbed again. There might be 10, 20, 30 safe routes between the office and your home, but once you find that first safe route, you probably would continue to walk it time and time and time again. Now, we can get actually a little bit more real than that thought experiment. We can watch how this plays out with real humans. In this video, the learner who is standing in front of us does not know what is being asked of her. The teacher who's over here is going to try to lead her to the behavior that they wish to be performed. In this case, it will be standing behind a chair. This learner has been told that every time there is a clicking noise, that is a reward, that she is right, and she will get candy. Let's watch how it plays out. The video quality is poor, I apologize. That was the wrong behavior, she's failing. And there she does it. She has completed the final behavior. So that took 50 seconds for an adult who knew nothing of what was being asked from her to intuit what was desired in this case. Now, let's see what happens if we activate the alternative pain avoidance system. This person has an eStim collar on their wrist, and we're going to see how it goes for them. Now, right off the bat, you'll notice this is fast-forwarded. And that is for a very key reason. Yeah, it doesn't look fun, does it? What happens very quickly is that he ends up sticking in this 5-foot location for the rest of this video. He actually never ends up completing the task, because at this point, he's talking to the teacher, and he's saying, I tried that, it didn't work, I tried that, it didn't work, and now I don't want to move because I'm afraid of being shocked again. So this learner actually never completes this task because they become so afraid of the punishment that they don't want to try for that goal anymore. This actually ended up being 2 minutes, and remember, in the first case, in 50 seconds, they had reached success. By 50 seconds into this video, this learner had frozen in place and stopped wanting to try. Now, if you are in a workplace and you have a choice between working with a learner in this perspective or this one, that choice is probably pretty obvious. But if you are sitting in the audience being very skeptical, I applaud you. You should be. You're probably thinking, I don't put a shock collar on my coworkers. And congratulations, you are good human beings. You should never put a shock collar on a person or animal. I agree with you. But you do not need to use a shock collar to be aversive to learners around you. Does something like this look familiar to anybody? Yeah, me too. Yeah. I know, we've all been there. And if you ask the person who wrote this diff, who in this case we might assume was a junior engineer, how this felt, they would probably tell you it did not feel great. To come back to something they had worked hard on and find a cascade of comments about all the things they had done wrong and needed to fix. And unfortunately, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because that engineer put up a diff that got critiqued, the next time they go up to put up a diff, they might be anxious. They might put it off. They might rush through it. And unfortunately, by doing all of those things, they will probably make more mistakes, guaranteeing that they will have more comments on their next diff. Now, you can compare this to a hypothetical case in which a junior engineer that you're working with puts up some code or puts up a technical design doc, and you immediately jump in and tell them about everything they've done brilliantly. They may have thought about a particularly nuanced edge case. They may have handled an error in a very beautiful way. They may have added really thorough documentation, and you can go into that diff and tell them each one of those things that they had done right. That person, the next time they put up a diff, would probably be eager to do so. They would maybe be anticipating how good it would feel to have people affirm that they were a good engineer and to get that positive feedback. And they would probably spend a lot more time on that diff and double-checking all of those things that they had gotten feedback for, positive feedback for, in the past. So again, it can be a very self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, the next question that probably comes to mind is, Christina, are you telling me that if someone puts up a terrible diff, I have to say that it's great? And no, that's of course not what I'm telling you. That would not be feasible. But what I am telling you is that we should stop them from putting up the terrible diff in the first place. Where I work in Silicon Valley, we are so incredibly focused on making feedback palatable. We have it in our company cultures. We have a value at Pinterest called Care with Candor, which tells everybody that it is so great to speak your mind freely and tell everybody what they can fix. We have workshops about how to get better at giving and receiving feedback. We have yearly performance reviews at my company that require that you give people negative, they call it constructive feedback, but you have to point out the areas that they are capable of doing better, is the nicest way I can put it. We have this entire industry built around this idea that we should take this thing that's naturally a little aversive and just turn it into something that everybody wants to hear. What if instead, though, we spent all of that time and energy setting people up for success in the first place? Now, in the animal training world, we take this for granted. When we get a new animal in our home, we have fences. That fence is setting them up for success of not running away from us and not running into the street. If we have a new puppy who likes to choose shoes, like mine did, we might put the shoes away into a cupboard. That sets that puppy up for success because they no longer have access to the shoes to chew on and therefore can't get in trouble. But when I bring this up in a people context, people often rebel. They say, they should know better. They're an engineer with this many years of experience. I shouldn't have to manage them. I shouldn't have to tell them. And I get that. It can be frustrating when people don't live up to the expectations that you have of them. But here's the thing. That may be frustrating, but trying to force someone who's shown you that they are not capable of doing that skill right now to do it anyways doesn't get you into any less of a frustrating situation. It sets you up for further failure. In two key regards, things go south. First, that learner starts rehearsing undesirable behaviors. If you think an engineer should be able to write better code than they do, and you ask them to continue writing code, but they keep using the wrong paradigms, it is going to become more and more and more natural for them to write code like that, making it harder and harder and harder for you as their tech lead to modify them into a new pattern of writing cleaner code. And second, it damages your relationship with the person that you're working with. Because every time you have to point out that they've done something wrong, it takes something from your relationship. And even if you choose to let it go and say, we can just ship that code, it'll be fine. Even in that case, there's a hint of frustration in you because you wanted something better from them and they didn't do it, and you're sitting there thinking about how they didn't meet those expectations. What if instead we focused on management? That would be a win for the learner in that they wouldn't have to experience failure, but it would also be a win for us in that we would not have to take on that punitive role. We wouldn't damage our relationship with them, and we wouldn't be on the hook for leaving 25 comments on a diff, because that's not a fun way for us to operate in a workplace either. The question we should be asking ourselves is, how can we make success most likely in our interactions with other engineers? If we go back to that initial example of putting up a diff that got a cascade of comments, there are multiple different ways we could have backtracked and made success more likely. First, we could have broken the task up, and that junior engineer might have been more successful on smaller pieces. Second, we could have offered to pair program with them, and then there's none of that opportunity for them to go down a wrong path for a long time before we find out. Or third, we could have just verbally strategized with them. We could have said, hey, how are you thinking of approaching this? And then as they told us, maybe it was great, in which case we say, I love what you're thinking. Or maybe there were some things they weren't considering, in which case we can say, have you considered? If we do some of these things, you can imagine that the impact on the engineers that you are working with would be tremendously positive. They would not be set up to fail, they would increase their self-confidence, and they would likely be more invested in that project as a result, achieving your goal as their tech lead of up-leveling their skills while also making your job easier because you have to monitor them less. So, one key takeaway I've had from animal training is asking myself always, how can I set this situation up so that success is the most likely outcome? Now, management is very much a in-the-moment situation. If someone shows you they have a skill set and it's not the skill set they need, we manage. But you don't always want to have to manage all of the environmental factors around the people you work with. You want to be able to give them autonomy and for them to still be successful within that autonomy. That's where learning comes in. Learning fills the gap between where someone is right now and where we hope they will be in their skill sets later on. Now, we have some sayings in the United States that are probably permeated worldwide at this point, but they very effectively capture much of our philosophy around learning right now, which is just do it. There's also a less polite acronym that people use around reading the manual, and you know what I'm talking about. All this amounts to is all you should need to learn is some documentation. You want to know Dagger? Why don't you go read the documentation? You'll be fine. Let me know if you have questions. The problem is, this is not a science-based approach to learning. And in fact, what we know from behavioral research is that this is not tremendously effective. And the reason for that is that people often become overwhelmed in these scenarios. And as we covered before, when people are in a threat mode, their sympathetic nervous system is online. And one of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system is that it narrows people's focus to only what is necessary to keep them out of harm's way. That means they can't think creatively, they can't be relaxed, they can't think laterally. And these are not good traits to have when you are hoping that someone can learn something as complex as Dagger. This is not a good frame of mind to be in. So, how do you address something like that? In the dog training world, we have the concept of a threshold. And before I start any session with my own dog, Cash, or with any other dog that I'm working with, I evaluate where they are in regards to their threshold. If a dog is panting, licking their lips, has their ears pulled back, or is unusually still or unusually energetic, I know that they are stressed and it is not the right time to try to teach them a new trick. In those cases, I rely on management. I say, what is stressing you and how can I minimize that? Can I remove you from the situation or give you a calming activity to keep your mind occupied? If, however, the dog's body language is very loose and wiggly, and their facial muscles are relaxed, and they're looking at me eagerly, and they can respond to commands that they know well, that animal is in a place to learn, and I will proceed with that session. Now, a great example of where this goes wrong in the workplace happened to me just 2 weeks ago. I was in a conversation with 2 of my teammates about a technical design doc, and these teammates strongly disagreed about the direction that that design doc should go. They disagreed so strongly that they were almost yelling at each other. It was not the type of situation that you want in your workplace. Now, there were 2 courses of action that were proposed after this very heated altercation. 1, let them figure it out. 2, escalate to someone more senior to make that decision. Now, the argument for that first path is the one we know best. We've probably all heard it in our workplaces. We can't do this forever. They need to learn how to figure it out. They need to grow this skill. We can't save them. So we went with the traditional path. We tried to let them work it out because this is what corporations are set up and biased towards doing. But predictably, things went exactly the way brain chemistry tells us that they would, which is that these learners were not in a place of growth. They were not in a place to learn conflict resolution. So when we asked them to work through it, they did the thing that brain chemistry tells us they would do. They found the nearest exit to get themselves out of an unpleasant situation. What this looked like is that they took one idea and they took the other idea, they put them together in the same doc, and they said, congratulations, here's our technical design. This was the worst possible technical design that they could have come up with. We really needed a decision on one route or another, and what we got was just both of them in one Word document as a decision. This made no sense for the company, it made no technical sense, but it made every bit of human sense. Because when your threat systems are activated, you are not thinking about achieving the objective, you are thinking about escaping the threat. Just as we saw earlier with the learner with the shock collar on his arm, he stopped caring about the objective and he started caring more about the threat. So, before we try to teach one of our coworkers or one of the junior engineers we work with, we should first be asking ourselves, can they actually learn right now? If they can, great. Let's talk to them about a better technical design. Let's talk to them about a better way to communicate. But if not, let's consider management instead. Now, say that you do that check and they are ready to learn. What do you do then? Well, you decide what to teach them. Now, we often go awry here in both animal training and the human worlds as well. It should be simple. You say, well, they're struggling in this area, so I'll teach them that area. We have a natural bias towards concrete skills, like teaching someone how to use retrofit or how to use compose. What we often overlook when we're working with both animals and people is that often problems come down to concepts like confidence, problem solving, and critical thinking, and not just a very particular skill set. We can see this in the case of someone who gets on stage, opens their mouth, and can't say anything. A skills-based approach to that problem would be to take them somewhere and teach them how to pronounce a word, like hi, or my name is. But what is likely going on in that case is that it has nothing to do with that specific skill set. If you put that person in another context, they would be able to pronounce words. What is actually going on is that they are missing the concept of confidence that allows them to take the skill of speaking and transfer it into an audience scenario. So, if we focus narrowly on skills, we really aren't serving this person. Maybe we could get them to a place where they can speak on stage, but our time could have been better spent. I will give you an example from my own life with my own dog. When he came home as a puppy, I was so excited, but quickly, problems started to mount up. He was barking at other dogs, he was sometimes resource guarding, he was struggling with separation anxiety, and his recall back to me was awful. If I had hired a trainer to work on every single one of these areas, it would have been a long process and pretty demoralizing. But by taking a step back, it turns out that all of those problems that he was struggling with are linked by one key concept, which is disengagement. Barking at dogs was a frustration behavior because he couldn't imagine a world in which he wasn't allowed to greet them. Resource guarding, he couldn't disengage from a bone. Separation anxiety, he couldn't disengage from me when I left the home. And when his recall was awful, it was because he couldn't disengage from the environment. So by focusing on this one concept, I was able to solve a host of different specific behaviors without needing to address them one by one. Now, in the workplace, this might look slightly different, but it's still the same concept. If someone is showing a host of different behaviors that you're displeased with and you would like to fix them, like maybe they're not adding tests, sure, you could do a spot fix. You could add a testing mandate that says 100% of code needs to be tested or you cannot check it into the code base. But the problem with that is that if that behavior is driven by a missing concept, then it's going to crop up in other scenarios. There are going to show a lack of attention to detail in different behaviors other than the testing one that you just spot fixed. So by focusing on that concept instead, you can get to the root issue that you would like to solve. Now, what that issue is may vary. I don't know your workplaces. You can take a guess at what it may be for you. But at the end of the day, there's a key benefit to focusing on concepts above and beyond the 5-for-1 aspect, which is that if you stay fixated on skills and certain behaviors, you need that situation to occur again for that skill to be up-leveled. Take my coworkers who are having an altercation. If I identify that the skill that they're missing is conflict resolution, I need to wait for another conflict before I can test whether their skills have improved and work with them and give them feedback to make them better. I don't want another conflict to happen. I don't want that to be a thing that I'm looking forward to in my role as their peer and mentor. If, however, you identify a concept that is at the root of that conflict, maybe it was the confidence to hear someone say that you were wrong and not take it personally. I can work on confidence with someone in many situations, none of which have to be an active argument in the workplace. So focusing on concepts, yes, lets us focus on one thing and get 5 results, but also it lets us focus on things for a situation, preparing for something that hasn't happened, instead of needing to wait for a specific scenario to arise in order to make progress. So in this regard, we want to be smart about what we're identifying as a teachable moment. If at all possible, let's zoom out from specific behaviors we see in coworkers and instead take a broader view. Now, once we've identified something to learn, we need to acknowledge that learning can be very uncomfortable. And that means that for us, as teachers and mentors and colleagues to people, we need to do everything we can to mitigate that discomfort. There are a couple levers we can pull in that regard. First, we can be really smart about what criteria we are raising when we want to address an issue. Now, in dog training, we say that behaviors have not been fully formed until they're robust against all 4 of these vectors. And when we are trying to get to that place of a fully formed behavior, we usually choose one of these vectors at a time to work on. So ultimately, I want my dog to be able to sit at a distance away from me for a long time with many distractions, even if it's raining. But I would not ask them to do that right away. Instead, I would work on building up duration on its own. Because if I try to build up duration at the same time that I am making it harder in a different vector, the likelihood of failure skyrockets. For humans, the effect can be the same. If you are asking a junior engineer to tackle a more technically complex project than they have ever done in their life, it is not a great time to also increase your criteria on autonomy by going on vacation for 3 months. That is a recipe for failure. That engineer is not going to be successful. So when we are raising criteria and helping people level up, we should be careful about raising one at once instead of trying to get them to improve all their skills at the same time. Next, the when of criteria raising can matter significantly as well. Now, many of you have probably never thought about the when, just like I hadn't, which means this is your default model. You just always raise the criteria. If someone shows you that they can do one thing, you expect them to be able to keep doing that thing and then also make it a little bit harder the next time. We do this with animals in training all the time. But this is not a great model. You can probably guess why. First, it makes failure almost inevitable. Because if you keep pushing someone as they're successful, pushing them more and more, at some point, you will turn over into the place where they're not successful. You are making that inevitable. And 2, you are sapping the joy from the process of learning. Because if you were in a situation where you were working out and your coach made every sprint that you did double the distance, so you start at 200 meters, the next one's 400, the next one's 800, the next one's 1600, you would expect to finish one and feel good about yourself. But what would actually happen is you would finish one and you would think, that was really hard and it only gets harder from here. It always gets harder. So instead of relishing what you had accomplished in the prior work, you would be looking ahead with dread to everything yet to come. So the way we work with this in animals is that we try to vary when we raise criteria. My favorite pattern for working with my own animals is to use an easy, hard pattern. This has a couple benefits. First, it reduces the risk of failure because every time we ask something hard of someone or an animal, we give them a chance to recuperate in between with a confidence-building, easy win. Second, it also makes, if failure does occur, it mitigates the downside of it because you are immediately following it up with an easy win. So we don't want failure to occur, but if it has to happen, the next best thing is to immediately build their confidence back by giving them a project in which they succeed. And last, it makes the project much more fun because the learner is not always expecting everything to get worse and worse and harder and harder. Now, I know in a workplace, you are not going to be able to do easy, hard pattern with the people in which you work with. One, you probably don't assign their work, and so you have to work in the context you're given, and two, the business needs to take over. But even if you can't implement that pattern, in the back of your mind somewhere, you can be thinking, have I been constantly asking more? Is there a way I can build their confidence back up? You can be aware of the toll that it's taking, even if you can't necessarily affect it directly yourself. Now, that brings us to a fun point, which is you're raising criteria and they're meeting it, which is awesome, and you want to reward them. How do you go about doing it? Well, something that we know to be absolutely true in dog training is that the timing of your reward of a learner matters tremendously to the effect of the learning. We seem not to understand that in the corporate world, though. If your company is like mine, you probably get a review once a year to adjust your salary. Maybe you get it every 6 months. That means if you're doing something great, it can be 6 months before someone tells you that, or a year before they adjust your salary as a benefit to you doing good work. This is not effective learning. Everything we know flies in the face of this. But fortunately, if you are a tech lead or just someone who wants to mentor junior engineers, you are likely not stuck to this schedule because you are not that person's manager directly in charge of their cash compensation. Instead, you are likely working through verbal praise or Slack messages where you say that you did a great job. And in that regard, you can absolutely control the timing. So, in this way, we should always bias towards giving immediate and concrete praise to people who are learning new skills. If someone reads the Dagger documentation and they talk to you about it and they say something very insightful, in that moment you can say, I am so impressed with that insightful comment that you made, instead of waiting for your next one-on-one or your next team meeting or, heaven forbid, the year-end review. There's a second point about rewards as well, which is that you want to make sure that whatever reward you're using is actually a reward for the person that you're talking to. Humans fundamentally make the error of thinking that whatever we like, other people like too. I did this for my dog. I thought all dogs like tasty treats, so he will too. So when he does something, I will give him a tasty treat. And he very quickly corrected me that was not going to fly. He didn't particularly care for food, and it wasn't rewarding to him, so our learning stalled. Likewise, in a corporate environment, we tend to take a one-size-fits-all approach to rewards. Our managers give us money, our peers say, good job, and that's about it. But we can get a lot more efficient in how we reward people who are learning new skills. On screen, you'll see a snippet from my Harrison assessment. Now, this was done many years ago and is a great snapshot of this point in time for me, but would be very different now. But the reason I put it up on screen is because that it evidences a bunch of different things that I value and stack ranks them. As a junior engineer, when this test was taken, if someone wanted to most effectively reward the hard effort I was putting into learning a new framework, they could have phrased a comment around advancement. They could have said, this is the type of work I expect to see from someone who's at the next level. Great job. If they had instead focused it on something like work-life balance, like, wow, you worked so hard on this, you should take a day off, the impact of that would have been much less on me. I would have loved it. Everybody loves a day off, but it just would not have been as effective to motivate my learning. So you will not have insights like this about all of your colleagues, but surely in lunchtime talks, you know something about what motivates them, and you can act on that in your role as their mentor or tech lead. So try to reward effectively. And lastly, I would be completely remiss if I didn't talk about what animal training has taught me about how to handle failure. Because even if you try to do everything that I just pointed out in this presentation, something will go wrong. It is inevitable. But we don't have to handle failure in the same way we always have. Take, for example, a dog who needs to go to the veterinarian practice. Something unpleasant is about to happen. We wish that we didn't have to put them in that situation, but it's unavoidable. That animal can walk away with a few different learnings. First, they can decide that strangers are bad. because they went to a place with strangers, and that stranger did something that hurt them, and so now they're learning from that scenario, strangers are bad. Alternatively, that same animal could come to the conclusion that if there is a stranger wearing a veterinary's lab coat and they hover over you with a sharp thing and count 1, 2, 3, something bad is going to happen. Now, you can probably guess we would much prefer that second takeaway. Why? Because it is much easier for us to mitigate when it goes wrong. If a dog hates all strangers, that is going to be a huge problem. If they only are afraid of the situation where people are wearing a lab coat, standing over them with a pointy object, we can work with that. We can solve it. Now, this shows up in humans a lot. If you've ever heard the term imposter syndrome, you're pretty familiar with people having this reaction, where a project or a speech or something in their life doesn't go as they plan, and they immediately decide that that means that they're not qualified, that they don't deserve to be there, or that they're a fraud. What would be so much better as a takeaway when things don't go to plan is perhaps this project didn't work because I did not spend enough hours planning these tickets in Jira. As a tech lead or a mentor to someone, you can play a huge role in shifting from that giant takeaway that is very hard to work with to a more specific one. If someone comes to you and they're feeling overwhelmed by the learning process and feeling like they're failing, you can ask them, what's going wrong? What do you think is actually happening here? And if they say that they're a fraud, dig deeper. After you do that, you can also redirect their brain to consider everything that has gone right up until then as well. Because we know that when their brain is in that mode where they think that they are a fraud and they are an imposter, it is not in a place to learn. So if you identify something that went wrong and you want to fix it, you need to also transition them out of the fight or flight response and back into a calmer place of reference so that they can actually start learning and fixing it. So to that end, you can also ask them about everything that went right, and you will always find something that went right, I guarantee it. All right, that was a lot. So just to recap all of these things, we'll go through it in a speedy fashion. First, there are two primary ways you can affect behavior in any organism. You can add or remove something nice, or you can add or remove something unpleasurable. If you add or remove something nice, you are creating a pleasure-seeking phenomenon, and that means that the learner is likely to greet you with creative and operant behavior. They are likely to try new things and be excited to do it. If you activate the fear avoidance system, that learner is at risk of becoming frozen and overly analytical. You can avoid needing to activate that fear response system by employing management techniques. Management techniques benefit us. Oh, I skipped one. I'm sorry. Management techniques benefit us by keeping us from rehearsing undesirable behaviors, keeping learners from becoming too stressed to learn, or damaging our relationship with them. 6, we should be conscious of trying to teach when people are in a space to learn. 7, we should also be careful about what we're trying to teach. Sometimes when it looks like there's a host of things going wrong, it's actually only one concept underlying all of them. 8, when working on a concept, we can minimize frustration in that learning process by being very deliberate about what criteria we raise and when we raise them. 9, there's such a lag. We can employ rewards strategically so that we are maximizing what little effect we have because we don't control the money for people usually or even what projects they work on. And 10, when things don't go to plan, we can always minimize the fallout by getting specific about what the takeaway should be and then redirecting attention to everything that's gone right. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Hi, Soyan from
Hi.
QA from Superology.
Yeah.
I wonder that technique, add and remove and reward, does it applicable through my whole life, or at some point I become so advanced that I don't need that to think anymore?
No, so that's what's really interesting about it. It underlies behavior modification for all animals that we're aware of at this point. So that means human animals, it means non-human animals, and it is always true. So you can boil any behavior modification, any change in your life down to pleasure or pain and being added or removed in that quadrant that I put on screen. So it might take a little bit of thought to do that mapping, but at the end of the day, you can always map onto one of those 4 quadrant squares.
Thank you.
When are we meeting Kash?
Yeah, I know. I wish he could be here. He's busy.
Next time with the dog.
With his
Okay.
dog sitter. Yeah. Perfect.
Somebody else? Okay. Another question.
Hi, I have a question regarding from different perspective of view.
Yes.
Example, someone is a junior and someone who is higher up, maybe their tech lead, and he's more aggressive.
Yes.
What should junior take also the same approach of training the senior? Because you find the ways with what tilts him or something and try to improve the stuff. You get what I mean.
I totally get what you mean. And yes, absolutely. So one of the things that we have a lot of evidence of is that if you want to modify someone's behavior who you need to interact with, you can do it most effectively or with the least amount of fallout by using positive methods. It can be really hard to do. If someone is so mean to you, it is so hard to treat them with respect and to say, hey, I really like what you did there, because they're not saying that back to you. But what we know about learning is that if you actually want to change the situation, that is the fastest way you can change it with the least fallout. And so it is hard for us to do, but it would be the most effective way. And I think a lot of us know this intuitively, that when someone is upset with us and we're mean back to them, it's almost never gotten us where we wanted to be. Like it may cause suppression of behavior, which we see a lot with aversive teaching, but it doesn't actually fix the behavior. They will still be talking about you when you're not in the room and advocating against you when you're not around. So it doesn't get rid of the behavior when you yell and intimidate someone back. It just pushes it underground. And I would prefer someone who hates me be very verbal about it, because at least then I know what I'm dealing with.
Only love. And this will be the final question because we ran out of time. Thank you so much,
Thank
Christina.
you.
One applause for Christina.